I feel that a lot of times we go into relationships and then we don't listen. We're just kind of like wanting to say our part, but not necessarily hearing what the other person has to say. Just listen to them before responding. I think that makes like a great relationship.
Communication is really important. Knowing it's two people in the relationship. So making sure you're always checking yourself before blaming them, always.
You know, not all relationships are perfect. You know, there are going to be emotions involved. So I think patience is really the virtue that needs to be practiced.
For me, it's, I would say, two things. Trust, and being able to trust the other person without second-guessing anything. And then I think it's common values.
I also think I was going to say trust as well. I think that's the most important thing in any relationship. And I also think it's about being able to support that person whenever you need to and in different ways.
Lead with love. That's important. Always lead with love.
Hello, and welcome to You, Me, and Ennui, the show where you, the listener, and me, your host, Mary Kate Polanin, discuss the challenges that come with life's uncertainty. And that's the ennui. Today, I'm joined by Gemma Hartley. She is a freelance journalist, speaker, and author of Fed Up, Emotional Labor, Women and the Way Forward. She has spoken on the topic of emotional labor around the world, from corporate conferences to festivals at the Sydney Opera House. Her writing has been featured in outlets including Harper's Bazaar, Glamour, The Washington Post, CNBC, and The Huffington Post. She is passionate about creating a more equitable world in which invisible labor is valued and supported in personal relationships and public policy. Welcome, Gemma.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to be speaking with you on this topic. It's also nice to put a face and a voice to a name. Just for background for anyone who's listening, Gemma has written for our website, amendo.com, and she's delved into the theme of relationships from almost every angle possible. So we're excited to have her come on and talk a little bit more about a concept that really has struck a chord with a lot of people, like invisible labor. So Gemma, we can just kick it off for anyone who hasn't read your article or is familiar with your work yet on emotional labor, now invisible labor. Can you say a little bit more about what prompted you to write about it?
So what prompted me to write about it was a particular Mother's Day that didn't really go my way, but really I could have picked any frustrating moment where I felt overwhelmed by the mental load and the invisible labor that I was carrying in my household. People often ask me to tell the story of the article, which was about Mother's Day and this big fight that I got into with my husband over him not noticing what needed to be done around the house. It could have happened at any time. I could have picked a number of things to write about. That just happened to be the one. And I think what prompted me to write about it was that when I talked to my friends, when I talked to my family, this theme kept coming up over and over again, that I saw women were carrying a lot of this mental load that involved, noticing what needed to be done, planning for it, delegating out work, and then overseeing that work because it never really left their plates, even when someone else was doing the job. And so that is what really inspired me to write that piece and write my book.
Great. And the book that you've mentioned, just for the listeners, again, is Fed Up. And so it sounds like you've really gained a lot of wisdom and perspective, not only from your own experiences, but from talking to other people. And I'm just curious, you've really honed in on the dynamic with respect to you and your husband. But I'm just curious if you have taken any of that and applied that to other relationships, maybe friendships, and maybe this isn't true for you, but if you've spoken with anyone, maybe roommates, is that dynamic still at play in other types of relationships?
Yeah, I think in any sort of relationship you have, it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. This is really a cornerstone of what can set up a power imbalance in a relationship. And so when I think about emotional labor in regards to friendships or in roommate situations, you're still negotiating the terms of those relationships, just like you would in a romantic relationship. If someone is taking a disproportionate amount of the work to, say, maintain a friendship, if one person is, I think of like the group mom is generally the person who does all of that invisible labor. Say that you're going to go out somewhere. You're the one planning, looking at parking, making the reservations, and constantly getting the friend group together. That can become really tiring. And I see a lot of people get burnt out because they are handling that load and not communicating that they want or need other people to step in and do that work of upkeeping the relationship.
That's so interesting. I can definitely, what you said about the group mom really resonates with me. I certainly can think
Are you the group mom?
I can think of, it's interesting. When I think about that, I see the group mom in one friend group. And then in another friend group, I think, oh, I think I am the group mom in certain ways. For example, I have a friend group where we have a standing monthly dinner because we all live in different neighborhoods that are too far to get together on a regular basis. And we do have like a group mom, and she is definitely in charge of finding a time that works for everybody for us to all get together. But I will say, like, I step in because it is a thrill for me to find restaurants and places to go. So I would say, like, maybe it's divvied up a little bit more. But she definitely steps in and coordinates like that. But as I reflected on that role that she had, I thought, oh, are there friend groups where, like, I could step in and be a bit more of the group mom and gather our friends together? But that is a helpful thing to think about, whether or not, is it serving me or is it going to be a burnout thing? Definitely what you're saying is definitely resonating with some personal experience of mine and giving me a little bit more to think about for sure.
Yeah. And I think with friendships, we generally don't think about it as much because, like you're saying, it's a once a month commitment. And so daily resentments are going to build up a lot faster than those ones that are once a month. I'm doing this little load of work. And often it has really big rewards. You're getting together with this group, it's feeding your soul. It's just really like a lovely experience in the end for you. Whereas like doing the laundry every day, probably not as rewarding.
Definitely not. And I think you've hit on something. The daily resentments really made me immediately think of roommates, right? So that's like the closest thing you can have to a non-romantic relationship that has a lot of that dynamic at play. And so I'm just curious, what do you do in either a roommate situation or a romantic situation, or your partner, I should say, when someone claims that they're just not good at certain things? Or how would you respond, or how have you responded, and how did it go?
Yeah, so this is a really real thing. It comes up a lot in relationships where men will say, "Well, I'm just not good at this sort of thing." It's because it's a skill that you have to learn, and women tend to learn those skills much earlier on and take it on as a part of their identity. But the same thing can happen with roommates, where if one person has a little bit more of that tendency to take over, to delegate, they've taken on that role a little bit more, it's very easy for the other person to just kind of go with the flow, let that person take control, and let them get to that point of burnout. And so what I say in any type of relationship where you are running a household together, whether that is like you and a roommate in an apartment or you and a partner raising kids, and it doesn't matter what your living situation is. If it involves another person, you need to have shared standards of how you want your life together to run. If there's one person that is doing all of the noticing what needs to be done, delegating out all that work, it becomes really tiresome and really burdensome very quickly. And so I think the biggest thing to think about is how you communicate. If you're communicating primarily by either listening to what needs to be done and then doing whatever that is, or if you're the person saying like, hey, I've made this grand plan of everything that needs to be done, and I want you to do this, this, and this, and you're the one that is in control of everything. Both of those are not great dynamics. You want to be coming together with the person that you're sharing your life with at the moment and be able to talk about what are reasonable expectations, what makes sense for both of us given the constraints of our life right now. Because sometimes there's a give and take. I personally have never tried to strive for 50-50 in my relationship because I think there's a really big give and take and an ebb and flow to life that needs to be taken into consideration. 50-50 is sort of a pipe dream in my experience because things come up. You know, when my husband was going through a master's program and I was freelance writing from home, that means that the shift goes to me a little bit more. When he was home and searching for a job while I was writing this book, that needed to shift over to him a little bit more. And so I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind as well, that you're not just looking to like create this perfect balance and system. You're looking to cultivate a relationship and a life that works for that relationship.
Definitely. And I feel very affirmed in, the idea that 50-50 is an ideal, maybe not a reality. I remember when I had a roommate during the year 2020 when a lot of us were home all the time. But my other roommate was a nurse at a hospital in the cities. She was going into work every single day, and I was just home, working from home, still working, but with a lot more time to take out the recycling, take out the garbage. And I actually don't think I never felt a sense of resentment, mostly because I was so grateful that she was going into her work and I knew that her work was so important. But we definitely did schedule more time for like quality time to hang out and watch a movie just to balance out that relationship. So what you've shared really rings true to me. I want to go back to something that you shared about a shared vision for your living situation. I hope I said that correctly, or shared values when it comes to a home. And it reminded me of my freshman year in college when I had a roommate who was brand new to me. And our RAs had us sit down and make a roommate contract agreement and come to agreement about like, where do you keep your shower shoes and what is fair in terms of taking out the garbage, or what is your sleep schedule like, really getting to know someone who you're brand new to, but now have to share a twin bed 5 feet apart. At least that's how it was in my college experience. And I'm curious if a tactic like that, or maybe not so concrete, but is that a practice worth revisiting when you are in any new living situation? Or does it feel too childish? I'm just curious on your perspective.
I don't think it's childish at all. I think that having some structure can really help people. Now, that being said, some people are going to be really resistant to that. And so you kind of have to feel out the person that you're with. If you're coming to them with like a spreadsheet of what we're going to do and how we're going to divvy things up, for someone like me, I would love it. I love a spreadsheet, but not everyone feels that way. And so sometimes it's a more fluid conversation. But I think that making that structured time to figure things out is the most important part of that. So it doesn't need to look a certain way, but you need to be intentional about creating a space where you can talk about these things. I think that the best way to do that is to blend a little bit of fun and the serious conversation. So, maybe you go out to lunch or dinner or coffee, whatever situation is going to put you and the person that you're talking to at ease. I like to go on hikes with my husband and we talk through a lot of stuff because we're doing something that is really enjoyable. And so having those conversations comes a little bit more naturally and it doesn't feel as serious or as claustrophobic because we're outside.
I love that. Thinking about locality, I live in New Jersey and my boyfriend and I love to go down the shore. And I think now that I reflect on it, some of our best conversations have been in the car on the way to our favorite spot in the Jersey Shore and then in the car on our way home where we've just experienced our favorite place, which is the shore. So that actually makes a lot of sense to me. So I guess now we're talking about when everything's rosy and when there's great times to have conversations, but getting into some of the more challenging parts, if the person that you're either living with or in a relationship with doesn't pitch in, when does the time come for a more difficult or uncomfortable conversation?
That's a really difficult question because I think the timing is different for every individual. I would just say that the time that it is not is when you're really worked up about it. And that is something, I wrote about in my original article. Like when I was first talking to my husband, it was more of like a meltdown and no progress came of that first conversation. But when I was able to step back and really think about like, okay, what are the key issues here? And it was that, I didn't really feel seen. I didn't feel like my work was valued. I didn't feel like he was doing the work of noticing what needed to be done or making plans himself, which left me with a lot of that mental work. And so being able to think logically and reasonably about a topic that can be really fraught with emotion just gives you that space to really like come back to thinking about what the real issue is. And it gives you that time and space to think about the other person as a person and not a problem, because that is something that I think I have gotten stuck up in before, where I am viewing my partner or his behavior as a problem rather than seeing him as a person with blind spots, with other things going on in his life that could be affecting the way that he is viewing our life. And so I think taking that time and not going into it when you're really angry, like when you see the dishes in the sink that your roommate has left, like, and you're really worked up about it, that's not the time for the conversation.
Right. And sending a group text to the roommate chat maybe is not the best way to approach it. I'm definitely guilty of that.
It's hard. You're a lot of the times you're navigating these conversations for the first time. You're bound to make some mistakes. I have certainly made my fair share of them. But if I could give like one piece of advice on that conversation that is difficult, give yourself the time and space to not be angry as you go into that conversation.
Right. And I love what you said about, understanding that even though that this is a worthwhile endeavor, you're still going to make mistakes. I guess I'm curious, and maybe you don't have an answer, but have you made a mistake in the pursuit of communicating this issue, and what did you do to correct it, or how did you maneuver that situation?
Oh yeah, I've made many mistakes. I think one of the first ones was not one of the first ones, but one of the most prominent ones was when I wrote that article. I was talking about this situation where I was really frustrated with my husband. And I said to him, like, I don't want to tell you what to do. I want you to notice what needs to be done. Really great sentiment. I did not say it very nicely. And we also did not have great communication in that conversation because I was so frustrated and angry and resentful in that moment. So that rift took some repairing where I had to apologize for the way that I went about that conversation and start to talk about the things that were actually bothering me. I think when it comes to making those mistakes, we usually make, well, I won't say we, but I usually make mistakes because I am coming from a place of defensiveness. And in order to repair those mistakes, I usually have to go into that space of vulnerability that I wasn't willing to go to in the first place.
That makes a lot of sense. Yes, definitely can. What you're saying about recognizing when you're feeling defensive, but the need to be vulnerable, I think definitely rings true for me. I hope it's ringing true for some folks. So thanks for that insight. So speaking of the article, have you received feedback, negative or positive, about what you've written about invisible labor that's maybe changed your mind about anything you've written?
Yeah, I have a lot of evolving thoughts about the writing that I've done and the way that I would write that book differently now. I had a 6-month deadline on that book. It was very, very short. And so I had barely had time to sit with this concept before I was like putting a book out into the world that was really like claiming me to be an expert on this topic, which I was in some ways and I wasn't in others just because of the amount of time that I had to sit with it. And I think one of the biggest things was I use the term emotional labor. You've been using the term invisible labor. That is the term that I very much prefer. And the reason for that is because a lot of people made really good remarks about that being really imprecise language. And I had made a case for using the term emotional labor, mostly because I had used it incorrectly during the article that I had written. I had been working off of the work of other people who had sort of been shifting the definition of emotional labor. And when I used it and it blew up, that really brought that, what is the word I'm looking for? The sort of distance between the original meaning of that word and this new interpretation of it. And I played around with using a lot of different terms for emotional labor, invisible labor being one of them. And it ended up that we used emotional labor thinking that because I had been on a lot of podcasts, radio shows in, this piece talking about emotional labor, that I should stick with it. And I wish I had changed it because the language was not precise enough. And a lot of people have issues with invisible labor as well. I don't think there is any perfect term for talking about this work, but I definitely have had my feelings evolve on using that language.
Thank you. Switching gears a little bit more versus comparing the reaction to the term emotional labor, invisible labor, the language that we use around it, getting to the brass tacks of the advice that you're sharing, what do you feel like people have responded to the most when you're sharing your insights?
I don't think that there is necessarily a piece of advice that has resonated the most. I think what resonated was the experience. I shared a lot of really deeply personal things about my own relationship in the book and in that article. And the messages I get that are the most impactful to me are the ones that say, thank you, because this made me feel seen. It made me understand something about my life that I couldn't quite put my finger on. And so that, I think, is the most valuable thing about writing this, is that it has helped other people feel less alone in the feelings that they have, in putting language to their experiences. And, that's the most valuable thing writing has ever done for me. The things that I have read that have made me feel less alone are things that I hold really dear to me. And the fact that I have been able to do that for other people, it blows me away every time.
That's really beautiful. And really is the sum of the mission that we have with the work that we're doing. And it's what makes you such a great collaborator with Amendo, because we really want to highlight people's experiences to help other people feel a little more seen, a little less alone, and maybe invite them into a community. And that's really what we're trying to develop with this podcast. The title is You, Me, and Ennui. And so we're really trying to invite our listeners to think about different topics a little more deeply, maybe in a different way. So our focus right now is relationships. So that's why we've invited you to come on. And, personally myself, as we workshop the title of this podcast, I'd never come across the word ennui before. So it's an ever evolving term for me. And so something I kind of wanted to invite our guests into is just contemplating this idea of ennui, but also trying to come past it. So if you're not familiar, if anyone's listening at home and you were me about 6 months ago, what does that word mean? It really refers to a feeling of listlessness, or you could even say like the blahs. And we wanted to really hone in to this as it relates to making a decision. So we really want to resonate with folks that are maybe going through a lot of things for the first time. So new job, new place of living. We talked about earlier having this conversation for the first time. So all of that said, something that I would love to know from you is what practices or ideas have you found the most helpful when you are in a time of transition or needing to make a decision?
Two practices that are really like a cornerstone of my life, whether I am in transition or not, but especially during those times when like I feel that existential ennui, are meditation and journaling. And so those are the two things, like getting really quiet and having that space to myself, and then writing through what I feel. Those are two really important practices. When I'm in a time of transition, I also tend to try to take a lot of really long walks outside without distraction and just let my mind go and run through whatever it is that I'm working through. And sometimes it's not working through anything. Sometimes it's just blank and I'm just walking, and that is also really, really valuable to me. I went through a lot of big changes this last year. I moved away from freelance writing and I became a yoga teacher. I took on a full-time job as a marketing coordinator, which were really big shifts in my life. Now that all 3 kids are in school, I've rejoined the workforce for like in an office job for the first time in a really long time. And it definitely brought up those feelings of ennui quite strongly. And so I had to really work through that and find balance in my life. And so those 3 practices were really key for that.
And I can only imagine those long walks are in a beautiful, stunning Nevada backdrop or on a hike with your husband. So that must be lovely.
Yeah, it is. It's very beautiful. Even right now, it's very cold, and I'm not enjoying my walks as much because I'm not a big fan of the cold. But the mountains are snow-covered and beautiful, and I can see them from everywhere in my neighborhood. So it's amazing.
Just delightful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today and to share your story with our listeners. Could you share a little bit where people can find or read your work, in addition to, obviously, the wonderful articles that you've written for us on amendo.com that we'll be linking in the show notes, of course?
Yes, I am there. You can also find my work through gemmahartley.com. You're not going to find a whole bunch of new work. Like I said, I've stepped away from freelance writing. I'm in the process of finishing a novel, and that won't be in the world for a very long time. And so you can find a lot of my back writing there. Otherwise, I'm on Instagram. I very, very rarely, and Facebook very, very rarely.
Well, that's great. That's so exciting about your novel. We look forward to its eventual release. So thank you.
It's a long time in the making.
Thanks again for listening to You, Me, and Ennui. As always, I hope the conversation today offered a bit of insight into whatever you're facing, and know that there are at least 1 or 2 more people here in podcast land who can relate, because that's what we're trying to do, build a community. Looking for some deeper reflection on today's conversation? Be sure to listen to our bonus meditation after this for a few questions on how this topic might apply to your life. If you enjoyed the podcast, be sure to like, review, and subscribe. You can also join the conversation at our Discord server, linked in the show notes. I'm your host, Mary Kate Polanin, and the one thing that's for certain is that I'll be with you next time on You, Me, and Ennui.